We are now talking all things technology, opportunities and challenges in this particular sector. And to help me unpack all these opportunities and to make sense of all the challenges, I'm joined at the desk by Dobek Pater. He's Managing Director at Africa Analysis, and Finweek Journalist Jana Jacobs. Thank you so much, guys, for making the time to join us. I want to start off with the use of broadband internet, Dobek, because we always talk about infrastructure as the key enabler of what can be done and what can't be done. And maybe you can put South Africa into context for us. How many people have access to broadband in South Africa, and how does that compare with the international market?
So we're probably looking overall at approximately maybe 40% of the addressable market, so the people who can use broadband probably using it, and that can be broken down into people who have direct access, so they have devices that they use, their own devices, and in most instances mobile. And then we have others who have access to those facilities, but not necessarily their own. So, for instance, at work, at school environment, or things such as coffee shops with internet, or internet coffee shops, that sort of thing. If we look at South Africa, we probably not quite in the middle between the extreme haves and the extreme have-nots. We're probably a bit lower down than that. So most of the developed markets have very high broadband penetration levels. And it's also because it's readily available and inexpensive in the context of disposable income levels or cost of living. On the other hand, we have a lot of developing, emerging markets that have quite low broadband penetration levels. If we look at our neighborhood, let's say, in Africa and in Southern Africa, then we compare quite good. We're one of the better countries in Africa with access to broadband and the use of broadband. But having said that, we've got for instance, approximately close to 30 million smartphones now, but not quite, maybe 27, 28 million, but perhaps only about 20 million that actually utilize data, which means there is a relatively large percent of people who potentially have access to broadband that don't use it for various reasons.
So that's quite interesting, because we're not doing too well on access, but better than other African markets maybe. But what's the impact on the environment to actually start up tech startups in particular if you don't have access to broadband, Jana?
Well, obviously, I mean, if you're developing an app, you need people to use the internet to access them. So what we're seeing at the moment is that most smartphone users are using instant messaging such as WhatsApp, their email access, and Facebook. So very few people have and people are terrified of using their data, because obviously with a smartphone you've got automatic updates, so it eats into your airtime, so it gets quite expensive. So in terms of that does inhibit the tech space a bit. And then of course other things that are inhibiting tech startups is of course access to financing, because there's no lack of innovation, but a lot of people need to get good backers, and that's not always possible. And so that is hindering the tech space.
And as we keep working towards hitting access and hitting affordability, Dobek, we also have to deal with the odd legal wrangle, as we've been seeing with the auctioning of spectrum. Just give us a little bit of understanding of what was all this controversy all about.
Maybe it's not the odd legal wrangle. We've seen a lot of them, and this is the latest, I suppose, of the row of them. Effectively, there's a bit of a disconnect between ICASA, which is the market regulator for telecommunications and broadcasting, and the government through the Department of Telecoms and Postal Services, and also Department of Communications. In this instance, Department of Telecoms and Postal Services feels that it needs to produce what's called a policy paper to guide ICASA, the market regulator, on how the spectrum should be distributed between those who will use that spectrum, the operators, and build future networks, mobile broadband networks, continue building them. ICASA, in the view of the government, jumped the gun, although it is an independent institution, so technically speaking, it probably does not have to wait for the document to issue its invitation to apply, effectively a plan on how to proceed with auctioning of the spectrum. So ICASA's point of departure is we want to auction the spectrum. We want the government to make some money out of it, let's say umpteen billion rands through the process. And large operators buy most of that spectrum, but some was held in reserve, probably for a wholesale network to enable a range of other service providers to be able to provide services as well. The government feels a different process needs to be followed in all likelihood in order to make it fair and equitable in distribution of that spectrum.
How important is this wrangle in light of future regulations in the space?
Well, it's critical if we look at from a broadband availability perspective, it's critical because we already about 5 years behind our self-imposed timeline of making this particular spectrum available. It's going to add, drag things out and add more time into the timeline. So we'll just be falling behind in making broadband more available, more readily available, and growing our social and economic fabric.
So that's a little bit about the future. Let's take a look back. You've recently attended, I think it was the MTN Business App Awards. And maybe just, I mean, if that is the best of the best that we have being honored in South Africa, where do you think the most meaningful opportunities lie for entrepreneurs who want to play in the app space in particular?
I think we have to differentiate between wanting to go global, and that's very difficult for apps in South Africa at the moment because we come from a small customer base. But locally, we've got good problem-solving skills that we can address, and that's what I saw across the board with the apps that did well. They're addressing certain needs in the economy. So the app that won was Domestly, which provides cleaning services to clients, much like Uber does taxi drivers to clients. But what's wonderful about this app is it's a two-way street. So although the cleaners get vetted, so do clients. It's created 600 sustainable jobs in 6 months for previously unemployed workers. And it's this kind of innovation that's going to drive us forward. Education apps, and of course then also there was another app, Ikorka, which is focused on creating mobile payment systems easily for small businesses.
A final word, Dobek, I just want to get a sense of what you think needs to be done in the regulatory space, just in case the ministry position opens up and you're able to fill it. What do you think needs to be done in South Africa?
I'm submitting my CV now. There is room for regulatory intervention, and some of these things are regulation of the wholesale price of services, for instance, in order to make it easier for retailers to come in and use infrastructure to be able to offer a range of niche services, for instance. Another one is in the media space as well. So we can take cues from what's been happening in places such as European Union, but also in some of the African markets in terms of creating a more enabled environment for not only for development of infrastructure, but also then using that as an enablement to create apps, to create jobs at the end of the day in the not only the IT space but throughout.
Certainly sounds like a potential ecosystem that could make a huge difference in the development of not only South Africa but other African markets as well. A very big thank you to Dobek Pater, Managing Director at Africa Analysis, and Finweek Journalist Jana Jacobs.